destruction of the World Trade Center and extremely staggering loss of life there. So, you know, just as architecture and engineering projects are sometimes quite difficult, sometimes extremely joyful, this particular one has proven to be one of the most difficult. Not difficult in terms of reaching conclusions, though, but difficult in terms of the implications of those conclusions. Can you get rid of the ring for me, Anthony? Thanks. And finding people also open-minded and willing enough, like yourselves, to come and look at these facts. So our commitment to you tonight is to speak the truth and to leave you with extremely valuable information so that you can clarify what is science and what is conspiracy. But please, check out all the facts that you hear tonight. We're not looking for believers. You have to do your own research, really, because there are doubts about the official investigation that don't begin with the 9/11 Truth Movement. Let's start with the 9/11 commissioners themselves, who were not engineers, but mostly lawyers, politicians. What did they say after they produced this report? Which turns out they didn't even produce it. It was produced by a Bush administration insider named Philip Zelikow, who had complete control over its contents. We were set up to fail, they said. It's not to be considered the last word on the attacks, but only the beginning. Tim Romer on the commission. We were extremely frustrated with the false statements we were getting. This investigation is now compromised, says Max Cleveland, who resigned from the commission because of that. America is being cheated. The White House wants to cover it up. And John Farmer, the senior counsel for the 9/11 Commission, I was shocked at how different the truth was from the way it was described. There was an agreement not to tell the truth. This alone calls for a new investigation of 9/11. But listen to this. He's also quoted as saying, what government and military officials told Congress, the Commission, the media, and the public about who knew what, when, was almost entirely and inexplicably untrue. That is an extraordinary statement. And one of the many reasons that it's extremely important that we know the whole truth about this event. After all, it served as the pretext for the invasion of two countries in which already over 1 million people have perished, as well as the ensuing global war on terror and a host of other ills that we're suffering from still as a country in the U.S. and around the world, certainly here in Canada, where 24 citizens were murdered in the Twin Towers and more soldiers lost in Afghanistan. All this remains intact if we continue to sweep the truth about 9/11 under the rug. And only the truth about 9/11 will stop another 9/11 type attack from happening again. So, we need to dedicate ourselves to finding out exactly what happened and why. And so these are the reasons that we must peer back into this painful part of our recent world history and re-examine the relatively new evidence that we've not seen in the mainstream media. Speaking of which, Time magazine reports that up to 36% of Americans want a new investigation. They say this 9/11 truth movement is not a fringe phenomenon, but a mainstream political reality. Well, let's take a look at this other poll in 2007 by Scripps Howard Ohio University. Do you have?
I have a pen and paper. I'm ready to go.
Oh my God, you're good. Now, they say 16% of Americans believe the Twin Towers were brought down by explosive demolition. This is pretty extraordinary. Let's find out where we are in this room before we even begin. Some of us, I'm sure, believe the Twin Towers were brought down by explosive demolition because I know some of you. Some of you are unsure. Some of you already believe the official story. But let me ask, the official story, which goes like this. The planes hit the towers. There's a large explosion with jet fuel. A fire which weakens the structural steel, and we have a gravitational collapse all the way down to the ground. That's the official story. How many of us pretty much there? No reason to believe otherwise. This is what with the whole world almost believes. How many of us? Real high. I want to count you. One, just one, two. Any others? Two, three. How many are unsure? You've heard a few things. You're here to check out the rest. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And how many believe the Twin Towers are already brought down by controlled demolition? A few more of you. Okay,
Why don't you change it from belief to no? Or have
No, okay.
100% confidence, because then I'll raise my hand there.
All right, well, let me just tell you something. We NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, claims that they found no evidence for explosives or explosions at the Twin Towers. Later, they acknowledged, a year later, that they never looked for it. How can you find what you're not looking for? This is a rather extraordinary state of affairs, given the testimony that you're going to be finding, as well as the evidence tonight. So, fortunately, many others found it. We're going to be talking about it very, very carefully. Tonight we'll summarize that explosive evidence and then answer your questions at the end of the presentation. And we're speaking to you today because we're called to. We care very much about our country and citizens around the world also who are deeply affected by these events. And about our hard-won and all too easily lost civil liberties in the U.S. and those which you've lost here in Canada as well. After all, if these buildings were brought down by explosives, we've not been told the truth about these events. The official story would be a fabrication. We have extremely serious problems in the U.S. and in Canada that obviously pre-existed 9/11. So these must be addressed and with great urgency. So we're hoping that you'll join us after tonight in a groundswell of demand for a real investigation. And so we have 1,600 architects and engineers now signed on to the petition demanding a real investigation. This started back 6 years ago when I heard David Ray Griffin, an author of 9 books on the subject of 9/11 now, on the radio, who was giving this evidence, and I was just floored. Here I am, a Reagan Republican, doing my best to support the war in Iraq, as Colin Powell was giving me evidence, the irrefutable evidence for weapons of mass destruction and ties to Osama bin Laden. So that was my state of affairs, and when I heard this evidence, I never heard anything like this before. I just had to pull my car over and listen, and you know, he sounds credible, sounds believable. If he's lying, why would he be lying? What does he have to gain? So I listened, and I took that evidence to the 15 architects and engineers that I worked with at the time. All of them thought I was nuts. Afterwards, they all agreed with me. Oh my God. So we're going to see how many of you agree with the 1,600 architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, who are not conspiracy theorists. They're technical and building professionals who have nothing to gain. I'm earning about $25,000 less than I did as an architect, and I'm working twice as hard. I have less of a life by far. So don't anybody accuse me of being in this for the money. Please. It just doesn't work that way. I've been employed with San Francisco Bay Area architecture firms, and now I'm spending 100% of my time and energy to this cause, and you're going to see why tonight. But like many other architects, I've designed numerous fireproof steel frame buildings, like these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums, and the day-to-day construction administration service for this $120 million high school in San Ramon, California. More recently, I co-managed the construction documents for this $400 million mixed-use project in Nevada with over 2 million square feet of retail parking structure and fireproof steel-framed mid-rise office space, altogether with over 1,200 tons of steel framing. So that's just a little bit about my background. We started a website 6 years ago. You can use it for your reference. It's ae911truth.org. We're going to be going through these points very rapidly tonight. You can spend more time with the DVDs and the evidence on our website afterwards. Let's get started. 9/11, just the sound of it brings many of us, in the U.S. at least, back to that terror-filled morning where we were being attacked. Actually, at first, we didn't even know what was going on. One plane after the other. We're in a state of shock, looking for answers, not knowing what's going on, in cognitive dissonance, a state of almost infantile pain, looking for answers, looking for comfort from that pain, and looking to authority for that comfort, which is provided almost immediately, relatively within 24 or 48 hours. We have the answers. Who's responsible for this? Let's go get them. It's a campaign of psychological operation of shock and awe. Really, for the first time since Pearl Harbor, we are under attack in the United States. First time on the mainland, really, in modern times. Maybe the 10 years since has given us an opportunity to step out of that trance that we were placed in and look at the new evidence that was not available on 9/11. Now, I represent technical and building professionals and who do not have conspiracy theories for you. In fact, years ago now, the 9/11 issue has evolved well beyond conspiracy theory status into the realm of laboratory research and published articles in journals in scientific and academic communities. Relative to the conspiracy theories, though, as one of our mentors, Joe Princiotto, points out, to identify the perpetrator, first know the crime. That's our task tonight. So we're looking at the forensic evidence found at the crime scene and the eyewitness testimony. And what you'll find is that this evidence is rather extraordinary. So let's take a look first at what happened that morning and how this myth developed.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience. Elements of the myth. The impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
So there's the official story in a nutshell, and what we're going to do tonight is look at the scientific method, a way of winnowing error from truth, so we can find out what really happened. And this is, of course, what NIST said they used, but we'll find out how they did. We formulate a question. How did the towers come down? We perform research, make observations, and construct our best guess, a hypothesis. We make predictions of what would happen based on that best guess, test it with experiments, analyze the results, draw conclusions. Now, if the hypothesis is corroborated, we report those results in an open, transparent manner. So others can build on the body of evidence, and there's nothing secret. There's no black boxes that people are hiding information. You'll find that NIST did anything but report these results in an open, transparent manner. Nevertheless, if the hypothesis is not corroborated, we go back and construct a new hypothesis, one that stands a better chance against the experimental data and so forth. With this in mind, which is a method we've had for over 100 years in the West, now let's apply it and do some background research. Let's identify some typical forces that destroy buildings. It's not so difficult. Fires certainly can destroy buildings. It's an organic process. Fires move through a building in a given area every 20 minutes or so, moving on, looking for fresh new fuel sources. So it produces in buildings like wood frame buildings, like this one, if there were a fire, we have large gradual deformations. The structure would start slowly and tip over, falling asymmetrically with the path of least resistance, not straight down through the structure. And you'll note that we've never had, though, a fire collapse a high-rise building. There's a lot of reasons for that. We've had many examples which we'll show you. But in a steel frame building like the Twin Towers, and the third skyscraper to collapse on that day, which we'll introduce to you, we might expect something different. And there are tests which have been done, which should have been included in the background research done by NIST, because they are particularly relevant.
The way in which steel-framed buildings behave in fires depends on their construction. In this test, done by British Steel in 1995, a large amount of typical office furniture was burned to see what would happen to the heavy steel beams that supported the ceiling.
When steel is bare, when it heats up, it gets weaker. It's not that it melts in a fire. In fact, normal fires are not hot enough to melt steel. Even if you were, for example, to use an unusual fuel like kerosene, you cannot achieve temperatures hot enough to melt steel. But what happens is it starts to lose its strength. And as it loses its strength, it starts to sag. It becomes softer and sags and can no longer support the load.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be destroyed even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently. When is that? That was 9/11, where we had 3 fall due to fire. Now this is extremely relevant, particularly to Building 7, which had just those kinds of fires. Well, you see the kind of fires they had. But these fires have been raging in buildings like the burn in Los Angeles for 3.5 hours over 5 floors, and in Philadelphia, 18 hours over 8 floors. Caracas, Venezuela, 17 hours over 26 floors, and yet none of them came down. This is a relevant set of precedents that should be applied against the Twin Towers in Building 7, as is this destructive mode, an organic series of collapses, in this case earthquakes, where buildings fall over to the path of least resistance, not straight down, where we have structural steel elements that are not dismembered from each other, falling like a house of cards, and they're not, the concrete is not pulverized into powder, like you'll see that we had at the Twin Towers. A very different set of circumstances. Now, these buildings exploded. We have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like dust clouds, smoke clouds with pulverized solids in the air, thickly solidified, and solid-like formations, in expanding chemical reactions, gas clouds that expand as a result of those chemicals in explosives. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If you have these kinds of characteristics, you know you have explosions. Explosions are not a part of any of the official stories that come out of 9/11. So we'll be looking for those. Now, explosions can be harnessed to do destruction in buildings, to bring them down quite efficiently and fairly economically. We have hundreds of examples from all across the country to make our comparison, because this is the most commonly used method to bring down high-rise buildings. This is what a high-rise looks like when it's being demolished with explosives. These controlled demolitions can be engineered in many different ways. Normally, the purpose of a controlled demolition is to remove a structure while avoiding damage to adjacent structures, and to do so quite economically. So typically, a building like this is demolished by placing thousands of cutter charges throughout the columns and beams in the building, and then detonating them in a very precise order, starting with the interior structures and synchronistically timed floor by floor. Destroying the interior columns allows the exterior to be pulled in by the unsupported weight, and destroying the building from the ground up allows the weight of the building to be harnessed to do a lot of the destruction. So the result is an implosion, producing a vertical, symmetrical collapse at free fall acceleration into a consolidated rubble pile that's broken up and ready for loading and shipment. Now, this is a feat that only a handful of companies in the United States can accomplish, and fire never has. So you see where we're heading with this. We're going to compare the features of a controlled demolition with the features of these buildings collapse. Starting with, is there a sudden onset of destruction at the base of the structure? Do we have a straight down symmetrical collapse into its own footprint? Do demolition waves remove the column supports? Does that result in a free fall speed through the path of what was the greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structural steel in that building? Do we have a total dismemberment of the steel structure? Do we have minimal damage to adjacent structures? Do we have sounds and flashes of explosions heard and seen by witnesses? Do we have enormous clouds of pulverized concrete in these expanding pyroclastic-like clouds? That term pyroclastic comes from volcanoes, where you have just that incredible solids, pulverized and powders that are expanded throughout and deposited over miles and miles. Do we have squibs, or these isolated jets of dust and pulverized building materials? Charges that might be going off at the wrong time, explosive charges. Is there chemical evidence of cutter charges? If you have all of these, you know you have direct evidence of explosive destruction, because if you have any of it, you know you have that evidence. Fire can't create any one of these, let alone all 10 of them. So it's not going to be that difficult, our job tonight, to see what's really going on with Twin Towers. Is there government documentation that actually supports the theory of controlled demolition? Do experts agree? Those without biases, those whose paycheck does not depend on federal contracts. Foreknowledge. These take months of advanced planning to set up and place these explosives. Video documentation. All this is proof of controlled demolition. Well, with these typical characteristics of controlled demolition, let's start with the third high-rise to be destroyed, which I knew nothing about before hearing David Ray Griffin on the radio that night. How many of you have not heard or don't hardly know anything about World Trade Center Building 7 like I did before I got started? Go like this and raise your hand really high up so I can see you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And by the way, how many architects are there here tonight? Architects. One and, thanks, we got a meeting. How many engineers? A whole bunch of these. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And how many normal people? Awesome. Okay, you guys are the ones I'm counting on here. Well, this building is almost as tall as the tallest building here in Calgary, the Bow building in Canada. It's 47 stories tall, and it's the size of a football field. It's a huge, mammoth building, only dwarfed by what was at one time the tallest buildings in the world, the Twin Towers. It wasn't hit by an airplane, so it doesn't have the excuse, if you will, the reason that it came down, the airplane. We'll get to that excuse when we get to the Twin Towers. So it's a nice test case for us. It's about a football field and length away from the North Tower. Here it is standing tall. And when the towers went down in the morning, they got hit by a few beams. NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, tasked with explaining these collapses to us, says that the beams that hit it weren't really a significant factor in its demise. Here it is still standing in the afternoon, sustained 4 or 5 hours of fairly small fires, which I'll show you. But what we're going to do is look at the way it came down and see if it has any resemblance to a typical controlled demolition. Starting with, is there a sudden onset of destruction at the base of the structure? Let's listen to Daryl, a medical student who was interviewed that afternoon, a first-hand witness.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound. It sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was. It looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out. And it was horrifying. And then about a second later, the bottom floor caved out, and the building followed after that. We saw the building crash down all the way to the ground. We were in shock, and then the worst part.
Sound of a clap of thunder, a shock wave ripping through the building, windows busting out, and then the building coming down. With these witnesses, you're going to hear this again and again. All this phenomena is taking place, and then the building coming down. Not the building coming down, producing this phenomena. It's quite interesting. Well, here's Dan Rather describing his look, and for what many of us may be our first look at the destruction of this building.
What you're seeing are eye shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Now we're going to videotape the collapse of this building. It's an amazing, incredible picture word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
What? Oh, deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down. So here's Dan using his intuition, because he's seen the old hotels in Las Vegas that are famously taken down. It's kind of hypnotizing to watch. We all kind of have a frame of reference for this kind of destruction. We all should be using our intuition that way, as opposed to relying on experts who tell us that it's something else. But the problem is that Dan did not repeat these words ever again on TV. In fact, most of us, all of us, have hardly ever seen this building come down on mainstream television, even though it is the third worst structural failure in modern history, something that all architects and engineers should be studying in schools, and yet none of them hardly know about it. It's censored from professional communities as well as by the media. We'll talk about the media in a moment. Well, do we have a straight down symmetrical collapse into this building's footprint? Well, let's take a look from West Street. Pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. Watch the penthouse, which seems to fall about a half a second prior to the whole building. Let's bring it up. One more time. Indicating core column damage. We'll take a look at that in a moment. But I'm not quite convinced yet. Let's put building 7 on the left and a known controlled demolition on the right. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? We believe so. And yet NIST tells us these are the fires that created this destruction. These are the worst fires that we have photographic or video evidence of in this building. They say those fires were raging. On this floor, the 12th floor, occupied, by the way, by the Securities and Exchange Commission, which lost thousands of files related to hundreds of cases that it was actively pursuing against Wall Street companies like Enron and WorldCom. But we won't go there. This fire is said to have expanded these beams, pushing this girder off its seat on this column, causing this floor 13 to fall on 12, and so on for 9 floors, leaving this column unbraced for 9 floors, so it ultimately buckles. None of that could have ever happened because these beams, well, first of all, the fire was out an hour before this building collapsed, so it could not have been expanding these beams causing that process at the time. And the photos prove that. But even if the fire was here, it could not have expanded these beams because they're fireproof. They're insulated from the fires from expanding. Remember, there's only 20 minutes of fuel in a given area in the building that allows that fire to burn for 20 minutes. What did NIST do? They took all of that heat in their computer model, they applied it to these beams in 1.5 seconds, forcing them in the computer to expand linearly instead of allowing them to sag, which is what you saw in the test earlier. Okay, so let's say they did expand. Well, they couldn't have. Oh, because there are shear studs tying this beam to the concrete floor up above. Well, NIST says they broke those shear studs. How did they do that? By applying all the heat to the beams, but not to the concrete. Concrete and steel move together, not differentially. Those shear studs never would have broken. But let's say all of that happened. Could not have pushed this girder off of its seat, because that 12-inch plate would have to move 6 inches off of its plate. And any calculations you do relative to the expansion of these beams could not have pushed the girder that far anyway. But let's say it did, and this beam girder fell off of its seat on that column. This floor wouldn't have fallen anyway, because there's this girder here tying into it, there's this girder here tying into it. This girder would have simply hung there, supported by the floor, supported by the other girders. But let's say all 3 of these girders magically fell. This floor would have simply dipped down, probably never even would have hit this floor whatsoever. And even if it did, it wouldn't have caused sequential collapse. These buildings are extremely over-designed, 5 times stronger than they need to be. So you see, we have some serious problems. Again, this fire was out over an hour before on the 12th floor at the east end, according to a photo held by NIST. This is the computer that NIST used to justify the collapse of this building according to their theory of expansion. What do we see? Well, first of all, we see 400 structural steel connections failing every second during the 6 seconds of this, well, in their case, 16 seconds of this building. So that's like spraying a fire hose on a sandcastle. That's releasing all the connections almost at once. This is, the connections are the strongest part because they don't want them failing. So it makes no sense. Also, what else do you see? The top starts to crumple in on itself. They can't even get their computer model to behave according to reality, what really happened. Of course, you would, in a natural collapse, see massive crumpling of the structure, bulging and indentation on the sides. What else do you see? After 2 seconds, they stop the computer animation. They will not let us see what happens after that, because it begins to completely crumple and fall over, again, bearing no resemblance. So this is, and we have requested through Freedom of Information Act requests from NIST, where they are legally required to give us, the engineers and architects who design these buildings, who are responsible for public safety, the input data for these computers so we can do some research on our own to ensure public safety. What is the reason they gave in their denial of releasing this information? Might jeopardize public safety. Makes no sense whatsoever. With the holding on to that information is what's jeopardizing public safety. Yes, we would have seen massive bulging and indentation in the perimeter structure of this building. And yes, it does seem to come down nearly into its own footprint. Well, how does that happen? How do you bring a building straight down into its own footprint? We have to remove all 24 core columns in this building virtually at once and on at least 8 floors, and I'll tell you why in a moment, in order to bring this building symmetrically straight down. Otherwise, it'll begin to tip. If you get a few of these columns off, it's going to obey the law of entropy. It'll fall over to the path of least resistance, asymmetrically. But no, it comes down virtually symmetrically. How fast is it coming down? Let's listen to physics teacher Gage.
We can measure the downward acceleration of Building 7 by video frame analysis. I used a magnifying glass to place markers in the corner of the building on each frame. From this, we can get a data table and various graphs. The slope of this graph indicates acceleration, which is shown here to be about minus 10.279 plus or minus 0.6. Free fall in a vacuum is minus 9.8 in these units. That falls within the margin of error of this measurement. In other words, the rate of fall of Building 7 in the first few seconds is indistinguishable from free fall in a vacuum.
That's a pretty extraordinary statement. Why? What's he saying? I'm going to drop a brick. How fast is this brick going to fall? 3, 2, 1. It falls at free fall acceleration. Why? Because there's no resistance underneath it. That's the definition of free fall. No resistance. It's falling as fast as that building, but that building has 40,000 tons of structural steel. That's 5 times stronger than it needed to be to hold that building up for the life of it. So what's going on here? All that resistance was removed all at once. That's the only way a building can fall at free fall speed. And NIST acknowledges this. NIST acknowledges the free fall, but they do not acknowledge the implications of the free fall. And they only acknowledge the free fall when members of AE 9/11 Truth humiliated them publicly with those questions, that this is easily measurable. How did you get it wrong? Because they denied it at first. But then the implications are those, of course, that all that structure had to have been removed all at once. And at least 8 stories, because the period of free fall was 2¼ seconds, in which that building fell 8 stories. So this results in the total dismemberment of the steel structure as well. We had a 47-story skyscraper that was designed with moment-resisting steel frames, where the columns and the beams are very rigidly welded to each other on the perimeter in order to avoid 100-mile-an-hour hurricane winds, resist them. And so it falls like a house of cards, nevertheless, with each of those members disconnected from the other. Remember, Buildings that fall due to natural forces, you don't see the complete dismemberment of the steel structure. Do we have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions? Here's whistleblower Craig Bartner from the New York Police Department.
And the whole time you're hearing boom, 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 boom. So, I think I know an explosion when I hear it. You know, I was real close to Building 7 when it fell down, and I don't know, but that didn't sound like just a building falling down to me while I was running away from it. There's a lot of eyewitness testimony down there hearing explosions. I didn't see any reason for that building to fall down the way it did, and a lot of guys should be saying the same thing.
Well, they are. Here's another one. This is Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic, first responder.
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds. You heard explosions, like boom. And it's like a distinct sound. It's not like when the compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. To me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
And this person, Barry Jennings, who was on his way back up into the building after it was evacuated, not knowing that it was evacuated, heading up to the 23rd floor, experiencing this, along with his accompaniment, Michael Hess, Rudolph Giuliani's attorney.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing. When we made it down to the 6th floor. Then when we made it back to the 8th floor, I heard some more explosions.
They also sound
like a boom. Like an explosion.
More?
Yes.
We started walking down the stairs, we went to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Moves back into the 8th floor.
When we get outside, police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information on bombs, so you have to run. What?
Information of bombs. None of these explosions are a part of the official story for Building 7 or the Twin Towers, which we'll come to. Explosions like these?
Yeah, here's one of the guys who can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, no. You want to call your mother or something?
None of those explosions, which are really relevant, are they not? This one happened on the afternoon of 9/11, appear in the official story. Do we have enormous pyroclastic clouds of pulverized concrete? Well, let's take a look at NFPA 921, the National Fire Protection Association Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigation, all across the United States. This is the authority for that. And what they refer us to is large volumes of gas and large amount of heat released in rapidly expanding plumes observable directly after final destruction in explosions. Let's see if we have any such thing in World Trade Center 7. Indeed, racing away from the building's destruction in every direction at 35 miles an hour, or half the speed of freeway here in Canada, freeway speed, we have a lot more heat causing this expansion due to these expanding gases than were in those few small fires that you saw. Do we have chemical evidence of cutter charges? Well, we'll take a look at that when we get to the Twin Towers. But relative to these first 8 characteristic features, is this direct evidence of explosive destruction? We believe so, and that no fire cannot count for any one of them. Let's take a look at the fires. I mean, this is World Trade Center 5, a different building, fully engulfed in fire, as NIST claimed that Building 7 was. You saw the photographs that clearly show it was not. So, did it come down? No. High-rise, mid-rise buildings, fireproof buildings, do not come down due to fire. Never have. And this one included in Beijing, China. 44 stories in February of 2009, completely engulfed. If any building was going to come down, we would expect this one to. Did it? No. Here's before, and here is after. It's being remodeled now. Now, this is building 7. With these fires, and a lot of smoke, which is most likely from World Trade Center 5 next door, caught in this negative pressure against the corner of the building, wind current, brought this building down in 6.5 seconds. Very interesting. And completely destroyed, again, down to its elements. Well, there were some investigations into these buildings. First, we had volunteers, but these are not your average volunteers. These aren't your PTA type volunteers. These engineers earned $10 million annually, some of them, from defense contracts. So they're not unbiased whatsoever. But the FEMA report, who many of those engineers evolved into, the investigators of, got finally $600,000 of funding, and they released a report in May of 2002. Let's take a look at that, and we'll get to the NIST report a little later. But the interesting thing is many of these investigators worked their way through every one of these reports. They're not independent reports by separate investigators. In fact, many of them, again, are defense contractors who have a set of biases that are easily observable, discoverable, in support of their federal contracts. So let's take a look at what FEMA came up with, even though that's the case. The specifics of the fires in World Trade Center 7 and how they caused the building to collapse remain unknown at this time. What do you do when your hypothesis is not corroborated by the evidence? You go back and find a new one that is. You don't just say, further research, investigation, and analysis are needed to resolve this issue. That's what they say. But unfortunately, for those hoping to resolve the issue, up to 400 truckloads a day were removing that forensic scientific evidence from the site illegally, shipping it to China for recycling before the report came out saying, we don't know how this building came out. Maybe we should look at the steel. The steel holds the key. Well, Bill Manning didn't go for this at all. He's the fire-in-chief of Fire Engineering Magazine, editor-in-chief. Crucial evidence that can answer many questions is on a slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. That's a damning indictment from the head of Fire Protection Engineering Magazine, which coordinates all the fire protection engineers, and justifying the action. The next mayor of New York says, just looking at a piece of metal generally doesn't tell you anything. We have computers for that kind of thing. Well, we saw the computers that they use. Well, let's take a look at see what the experts say. Well, here's the top European-controlled demolition expert. He's 27 years in the business. Starts from below. They've simply blown away the columns. It's a controlled demolition. A team of experts did this. It's professional work, without a doubt. Fascinating. And one of the 60 structural engineers calling for a new investigation signed on to the petition at 8 on Truth. Kamal Obeid in California. A localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and pattern loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. Does that sound like something fire can even possibly do? Is there any foreknowledge of this building's destruction? Well, let's take a look at these mysterious construction workers and police officer walking away from Building 7 in the afternoon of 9/11, hearing an explosion, looking back over their shoulder, and saying into the camera, CNN camera, this. The building is about to blow up, flame and debris coming down. How do they know the building's about to blow up when it has a few small fires in it? Why are they moving everybody back to 6 blocks away? Well, what they said was that the building had structural damage. So they told the firefighters not to go up there and fight it. They're just simply scratching their heads, wondering, I don't see any structural damage. Why aren't we fighting that fire? Well, this gentleman, once again, Kevin McPadden, overhears the radio held in the hand by a Red Cross worker.
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off and you heard 3, 2, 1.
Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? This is pretty amazing. Better than that, though. The BBC is on the job reporting the collapse of this building 20 minutes before it actually happened. I am not kidding you. This is really good reporting. You want to be on the job this way. Now, they apologize for this error, citing the confusing events of the day. Does that make them psychic? What's going on here? Is there a script given to the media? Listen to this one. 11:07. CNN is on the job reporting the collapse.
In New York, Alan Frank joins us on the phone in Lower Manhattan. Alan?
Aaron, just 2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion. I'm now out of sight. Good Samaritan's taken me in on Blaine Street. But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower. And a firefighter who rushed by estimated that 50 stories went down. The street filled with smoke. It was like a forest fire roaring down a canyon. Now, as I think Patty Savvy and others have told you, all of Manhattan is covered, downtown Manhattan is covered with thick white ash and building material.
Wow. So what are we hearing? 15 minutes after the collapse of the last Twin Tower, we have a report of this building. Was it supposed to go down at that time? You know, had it gone down at that time, it would have been completely obscured, its collapse, by the massive dust clouds produced when the Twin Towers went down. Maybe it was a dud. We don't know. Maybe that's why the construction workers were going back into the building and walking away from the building hearing these explosions and so forth. Maybe that's why everybody was expecting it to come down. Fascinating. What we do know is that the hypothesis